Imagine waking up one morning to find the world's largest empire has simply vanished overnight, and not a single shot was fired. No invasion, no surrender, just gone. In December 1991, the Soviet Union, 280 million people, the biggest standing army on the planet, enough nuclear weapons to end civilization, ceased to exist. And the version of that story that most people know is wrong. Not completely wrong, but incomplete in ways that matter. Because the real causes weren't visible on the surface. They were buried in falsified economic reports, in classified budget documents, in a nuclear disaster that changed everything, and in the quiet decisions of mid-level bureaucrats who simply stopped believing. Today we're going beneath the surface, past the politics, past the propaganda, to show you the hidden forces that brought a superpower to its knees. This is what they won't tell you. Now, before you say, "I already know this story," hear me out, because we're not going to talk about Reagan and Gorbachev shaking hands. We're not going to do the version where capitalism won and communism lost, and that explains everything. What we're going to do today is go section by section through 5 hidden failures, each one running underneath the official story. And each one, when you look at it closely, tells you something about power, money, and what happens when a system is built on lies it can no longer afford to maintain. By the end of this video, the collapse of the Soviet Union is going to look less like a political event and more like what it actually was, a slow-motion financial and social implosion that the people at the top saw coming and couldn't stop. Let's start with the lie that held everything together. Here's the version of Soviet history that Soviet citizens were told throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. Steel production at record levels, industrial output growing every year, a workers' paradise delivering on its promises, and the numbers in the official reports, they looked good. The problem was, the numbers were not real. Soviet factory managers operated under a quota system. Hit your quota, you get rewarded. Miss it, and the consequences were serious. So what happened across the Soviet economy was entirely predictable. Managers reported hitting quotas they hadn't hit. Output figures were inflated. Waste was hidden. And the people at the top, who wanted to believe the system was working, didn't look too hard at the details. But here's the part that made all of it structurally fragile in a way that very few people discuss. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union had become what we would now call a petrostate. Oil and gas exports were generating somewhere between 60 and 80% of the country's hard currency. The dollars and Deutschmarks needed to buy technology, grain, and goods from the outside world. The entire facade of economic stability was sitting on top of one commodity. And then walk into any Soviet grocery store in 1982, 1983, 1984, and you'd see something the official reports didn't mention: empty shelves or shelves with things nobody wanted to buy. The gap between what state television was saying and what people were experiencing in their daily lives was becoming impossible to ignore. That gap between the story being told and the reality being lived is where this collapse actually began, not in 1991, not with Gorbachev, but years earlier, in the quiet moment when ordinary Soviet citizens stopped believing what they were being told and started doing the math themselves. While the Soviet Union was falsifying its industrial output, something was happening in California that would change everything. The personal computer revolution. Apple, IBM, Microsoft. The early 1980s saw the beginning of a technological shift that would completely transform how economies stored information, managed logistics, and made decisions. The Soviet Union chose not to participate, not because they didn't see it coming, they did, but because decentralized personal computing was ideologically incompatible with a system built on centralized control. Who controls the information controls the power, and personal computers, by definition, distribute information. That was the problem. So while Western companies and governments were beginning to manage their supply chains, their military logistics, their financial systems with increasingly sophisticated computing, the Soviet Union was still running its command economy on paper, on telephone calls, and on the judgment of central planners who could never have enough information to make the decisions they were being asked to make. Now here's the financial piece that doesn't get discussed enough. When the Soviet leadership realized they were falling behind technologically, they didn't accept the gap. They tried to close it through espionage. The KGB's Line X program was specifically tasked with stealing Western technology, microchips, computer designs, software. The program cost billions of rubles and employed thousands of operatives and informants across the Western world, and it largely failed. Not because the intelligence was bad, often it was very good, but because stealing a blueprint for a microchip doesn't mean you can manufacture it. The Soviet industrial base didn't have the precision equipment, the clean room facilities, or the supply chains to actually replicate what it was stealing. They were spending enormous resources to acquire knowledge they couldn't use. Meanwhile, the gap kept growing. And a modern economy that cannot efficiently manage its own logistics, cannot get the right goods to the right place at the right time, begins to break down in ways that are quiet at first and then suddenly catastrophic. Here's a question that rarely gets asked. When exactly did the Soviet Union run out of money? The official answer is somewhere around 1991, but the classified documents that have become available since the collapse tell a very different story. Internal Soviet economic assessments from as early as the mid-1980s described an economy that was functionally insolvent, not struggling, insolvent. The gap between what the state was spending and what the economy was actually producing had become impossible to bridge through normal means. But because acknowledging this publicly would have been catastrophic, it was classified, hidden in documents that only a handful of people ever saw. Part of what was draining the budget was what you might call the empire tax. The Soviet Union maintained control over a network of satellite states: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and more. These states required constant financial subsidies to remain stable enough to stay within the Soviet orbit. The Kremlin was, in effect, paying for the privilege of having an empire, and doing so with money it increasingly didn't have. But here's the detail that makes the desperation concrete. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was selling gold, state gold reserves, on international markets, not as a routine financial operation, as an emergency measure to generate the hard currency needed to buy grain from the West. From the capitalist nations, the Soviet system was ideologically designed to oppose and outlast. Think about what that means. The second most powerful nation on Earth, an empire with nuclear weapons and a space program, was quietly selling its gold reserves to buy food it could not produce for its own people. That is not a system that is winning. That is a system that is already in its final chapter, even if almost nobody on the outside could see it yet. April 26th, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explodes, and the Soviet government does what it had always done when something went wrong. It tries to control the information. For the first 36 hours, local authorities were told there was a minor incident. The reactor fire was being managed. Citizens near the plant were not evacuated. A May Day parade in Kiev went ahead as scheduled, with children marching through streets that were receiving radiation from the disaster site. The instinct to maintain the appearance of control, even at cost of human lives, was so deeply embedded in the system that it operated automatically. But here is what made Chernobyl different from every previous crisis the Soviet system had managed. The radiation didn't stay inside Soviet borders. Sweden detected elevated radiation levels and began asking questions. The international scientific community began monitoring. For the first time, a Soviet disaster was being independently verified by the outside world, and the Soviet narrative and the external reality could not be reconciled. Gorbachev had introduced glasnost, openness, as a reform policy. The intention was controlled liberalization. Let some truth out, demonstrate the system can self-correct, rebuild public confidence. What Chernobyl did was turn glasnost into something the government hadn't planned for. Because now, with slightly more press freedom, Soviet journalists and citizens began asking questions that previously would never have been asked in public. If the government lied about this, what else did it lie about? And this is where something quiet but irreversible happened. The mid-level bureaucrats, the factory managers, the local party officials, The low-level enforcers who had always maintained the system through routine compliance, many of them quietly stopped, not dramatically, not publicly. But when the central authority lost its moral credibility, the thousand small acts of enforcement that kept the system running began to break down. Nobody was issuing a revolution, they were simply stopping to bother. By the late 1980s, the economic failures were undeniable. The technology gap was permanent, the budget was empty, public trust had been shattered, and in the edges of the empire, something else was stirring. The Soviet Union was not one nation. It was 15 republics, dozens of ethnic groups, multiple languages and cultures and historical memories, all held together by the force of the central state. And when that central state began to visibly weaken, identity that had been suppressed for decades began to resurface. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the independence movements that had existed quietly underground became public. Mass demonstrations, human chains, political parties running on platforms of sovereignty, these were nations that had been independent living memory of people still alive in the 1980s. The Soviet military could have suppressed them those, but doing so would have required a level of violence that post-Glasnost would have been visible to the world. In the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, ethnic and territorial conflicts that the central state had managed through force began to explode into open confrontation. The army was being deployed inside the Soviet Union against Soviet citizens. That is not a picture of strength. That is a picture of a system that has lost the capacity to govern by consent and is discovering it also lacks the will to govern purely by force. And here is the detail that explains the speed of the final collapse. Many of the Soviet Republic leaders, the men who had built their careers inside the system, ran their own private calculation. They could see that the center was failing, and they made a choice. It was better to be the president of a new independent nation than to go down with a sinking empire. The velvet divorce mindset, letting the empire die to preserve personal power and wealth, spread quickly through the leadership class. What followed was not a revolution. It was a quiet agreement among elites that the game was over. And on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and 15 countries existed where one had been. So here we are. We started with an empire that vanished without a shot being fired, and we've followed that disappearance all the way back to its real causes. The great lie of the Soviet boom, an economy built on falsified data and oil revenue. If this video changed how you see this story, drop a comment. I want to know, which of the forces surprised you the most? Which one do you want us to dig into further? Subscribe, because what we've built here is just getting started. And until the next video, goodbye that could evaporate overnight.